we are for our 11th week of the Vikings. We're heading toward the end here. Last week we looked at Iceland, and this week we're going to start by looking at Greenland and Vinland, and then we're going to look at the land of the Rus. And it's just possible that we might finish the Rus this week, and if we do, then perhaps we'll alter our schedule just a little bit and maybe have a review session at the end before the final exam. Would that work for everyone? Yeah, you like that idea. Okay. How about, is anybody reading The Emergence of the Rus? Anybody here reading that book? How about Off Campus in Sugarland and Katie? Do we have anybody there tonight? Nobody there. Maybe they're late. Okay. All right. Since this book is out of print, I might, and not many people are reading it, I might go ahead and finish doing the Rus tonight, and then maybe we can have that review session at the end. But let's see how things go. Okay, we're going to look at the Vikings in Greenland and Iceland, but first I want to mention some news articles that might be interesting to you all to just connect medieval Viking things to the modern world. Here's an article from the New York Times, and it's probably a couple years old, but it says, Iceland joins whale panel, giving whalers stronger say. So there are two groups, well there are three, there are actually three groups that are out to hunt whales again after they've been forbidden to be hunted to keep the whales from disappearing. And this is really Iceland, Norway, and Japan. All of them want to hunt whales, and so Iceland has now joined that panel. The essence of the article is, for 2 decades, anti-whaling nations led by the United States have safeguarded the International Whaling Commission's moratorium on commercial whale hunting. But a vote last week allowing Iceland to join the commission showed a shift in power toward the defiant whaling nations. Iceland, a former whaling nation that quit the commission in 1992, was readmitted at a quarrelsome meeting in Cambridge, England, despite its declared intent to resume commercial whaling in 2006. For now, only Norway conducts an annual commercial hunt in defiance of the commission majority, although Japan takes hundreds of whales each year for what it says is scientific research. So Iceland and Norway are still out there hunting whales, and in fact one of my friends who had gone to Iceland recently said she made sure to touch try the local delicacy, which is blubber, and so she said it was very rubbery. Let me mention a couple of other articles about Iceland. Here's one. This is from ABC News, and let's see what, it's April 3rd, 2001. Gene by gene, scientists use genetics to trace Viking heritage. By mapping the genetic history of a remote British island group, scientists have uncovered new clues about the way Britain was populated and may even help doctors fight modern-day disease. Okay, geneticists at University College London set out to reveal whether the 9th century Viking invasion of the Celtic Orkney Islands is evident in the genetic makeup of its present-day inhabitants. By studying the genetic roots of a population, the study's main author, David Goldstein, says we can reveal facts about human history that archaeology and written sources are unable to uncover. And so now we're having a genetic study of the Orkney Islands, but Iceland itself has been undergoing a genetic study for years and years. In fact, it's a unique population in Iceland that is rather pure as far as its genetics go, and so it's a very good source for studying diseases in Iceland. So that's been going on for a long time. Okay, they're also mapping Celtic credentials of Orkney's males against the Welsh and Irish control groups, the scientists stumbled across a remarkable similarity in the gene patterns passed down the male line. The similarities suggest that the populations on the so-called Celtic fringe of the British Isles shared Y chromosome characteristics that predated the 5th century Saxon invasions of the islands. So it's having some surprising results. In contrast to the stubborn Celtic Y chromosome, Goldstein found there is a genetic similarity between the British Isles and the rest of Northern Europe in the X chromosome, in other words, women. Women enhanced the genetic diversity of the Isles starting approximately 8,000 years ago. Goldstein explains this may be due to the fact that men controlled the ownership of land and brought women to live with them, and sometimes even traded women as commodities. Okay, this is interesting, because if you would expect it to be the other way around, for there to be more men coming in from outside the core community, and this study has found the opposite result. Following up on the findings in Orkney, the research will continue to focus on areas that can be linked historically to specific populations group. York, or Jorvik, as the city was called in Viking times, is one of the 20 locations Goldstein's team plan to visit in the coming months. Okay, so they're doing a whole study of the Viking population. And here is another article. This is about exhibits that celebrate the Viking New World discovery. The Vikings, when they discovered the New World, were probably less aware of what they'd found than was Christopher Columbus. To them, it appeared just another northern territory with resources to gather and natives to trade with. Much has been learned about sailing characteristics of Viking ships by using replicas such as the Saga Sigler, modeled after archaeological finds. Surprisingly, tests show these Viking ships could sail within 70 degrees of the wind. Okay, and but they beat the Italian explorer by 500 years. Okay, this was at the 1,000-year landmark, and where's the date on this one? I can't find the date. Well, all right. They're finding the evidence of the Viking settlement. Well, I'll be talking about that in the lecture, and the evidence for the Vikings finding America, but let me go ahead and do it. The most important piece of evidence by far of Viking visits to the New World is a Viking settlement around 1000 that was discovered by Norwegian writer Helge Ingstad and his wife in 1960 at Lansall Meadows on Newfoundland, Canada. Okay, and I'll come back to this later on and read about it. Well, I'll go ahead and read it now. Excavations showed the Norse settlement consisted of 8 buildings built largely of wood and sod that housed up to 90 people, a little iron smelting place, and work areas. Artifacts found buried at the sites were in the Norse style of the 10th to early 12th centuries. Excavated boat-making materials and other evidence suggested the settlement was not intended for permanent colonization, but rather as a base for further exploration. 2 butternuts and a fragment were found at the site, which have never grown in Newfoundland but are found farther south on the Canadian mainland where resources were more plentiful. The sagas had told of Viking explorers finding lands bountiful with wild grapes and self-sown wheat, but the accounts were written off as myth until, in fact, they found this excavation. In the past 20 years, with little fanfare, much more evidence of the Vikings has been found at excavations of Native American sites across Canada and Greenland, suggesting the Norse were traveling widely around the northern regions for centuries, hunting, fishing, and trading. So there's quite a bit more that has been found in very recent years. Okay, now this goes on to tell a few things. Okay, here is another article, and again, this one doesn't have a date on it. I don't know why, there's no, but it's about a Viking ship retracing the Atlantic voyage, commemorating Leif Erikson's voyage to North America. It's a replica of a Viking ship called the Icelander, which sailed out of Reykjavik, Iceland on its voyage to North America June 17th. So this was in the year 2000, marking 1,000 years since Icelander Leif Erikson set foot on the continent. Okay, so we have a Viking ship and Leif Erikson. There's some information about Leif Erikson, and this would have been ABC News also. Okay, so in the year 2000, the Vikings were very much in the news because it was 1,000 years after they had actually made their voyages. So let's look at their voyages to Greenland and the New World. We looked at Iceland last time, and here is our map so that we can see. We were looking at Iceland and the democracy, if we can call it a democracy, the Republic of Iceland, the Icelandic Republic. We weren't real sure it was still a real democracy last time when we had our discussion about it. And now we're going to watch while the Icelanders go across to Greenland, and it's a very short distance from Iceland to Greenland, and then we'll see them go to the New World, and we'll try to figure out exactly where they went in the New World. Okay. It was the Icelanders who ventured westward to colonize Greenland and land on North America. Gunnbjorn Ulf Krakason around 930 was storm-driven south and then west of Iceland. And just like the discoverers of Iceland, the discoverers of Greenland were also storm-driven. They were lost in a storm and they discovered new land. They sighted some islands or skerries and the land behind them. The skerries are now known as Gunnbjarnarskr, sometimes Gunnbjarnareyjar. And according to Ivar Bardason, they lay halfway between Iceland and Greenland. Identification is usually accepted with the islands east of Sermiligak near Angmagsalik, east across Denmark Strait from Snæfellsnes in Iceland. And we'll see where that is in a moment. It's here is a close-up map of Iceland and Greenland, and the islands are somewhere in here on the way between Iceland and Greenland. That again, they use these islands as stepping stones to get to it. Here is Iceland. We can recall where Iceland is, and by and large, most of the explorers who went to Greenland went out of Breidafjordar here. Breidafjord. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. This seems to be the area where they start, although some start from Reykjavik, which is just to the south here. And here is a reminder of what the settlements in Iceland looked like, as we saw them in our drawings from Cormac's saga. In 982, Eric the Red, a native of the Jædar in southwest Norway, was declared an outlaw for manslaughter from Norway, and he was driven out of Hakadal in Iceland for the same reason. So he was not only an outlaw in Norway, when he got to Iceland, he was an outlaw in Iceland as well. He was banished for 3 years by the Thorsnes Thing in Breidafjord for yet a third outbreak of killings. So he was declared an outlaw twice in Iceland, a really criminal character. With Norway and Iceland then barred to him, he decided to sail east. I'm sorry, I have a lot of typos tonight. I didn't get them all. Okay. He decided to sail east and fill in his time by finding and exploring a new land sighted 50 years earlier. So they knew Greenland was out there. They had sighted the land. They saw it there. And it only took Eric the Red, who had been outlawed, to decide to go. So Eric sailed from Snæfellsjökull straight across to Angmagsalik, and then coasting south he reached the western coast of Greenland by way of Prince Christiansund, which is Cape Farewell. He found himself in a land empty of inhabitants, rugged islands of the archipelago, fjords and headlands, hills right back to the ice cap, and rivers and lakes, and best of all, Okay, the grassy slopes and scrub-strewn nooks, his for the taking, and he took them. When he got to Greenland, like Iceland, it was empty, and so he saw all this land there for the taking. Unfortunately, most of it was ice, but there were fringes of it that were habitable, as he found. Then for 3 years he explored the region between Jørjulfsnes, which is modern Ikkegate, which is the Eskimo name for it, and Eriksfjord, and the modern name is Tunnug Djarvik. I'm sorry, my tongue doesn't go around the Eskimo names very well. With his crew, he marked the sites of farms and homes to be for the future. He plotted out the land and where the homes and the farms would be. He marked also that the land was rich in animals, bears, foxes, and caribou. Okay, now here we have a close-up, and so you see that he sails across the Denmark Strait, right across from Iceland to Amagdalsvik here, and then he sails down to Cape Farewell down here. And looking at all the land here, this is the land he explored it for 3 years, but this is the land that's habitable right here, which is the eastern settlement, and then later on there was a middle settlement here, and then the western settlement up here. But of course the Vikings explored every place in Greenland. They didn't just stay in those settlements. And here we see him coming out of Reykjavik here. And here's Breiðafjord, the places that he came from. He saw Skarsgård-bred sea animals. Wherever there was water, there were fish. It was enormously rich in animals and birds and fish and life, and birds everywhere that had never known the fowler's snare. And so all of these animals and fish and birds, you could just walk up and take them because they had never been around human beings before and they weren't afraid. So this, of course, was a hunter's paradise as far as being able to catch all of those animals. Leif then sailed back to Breiðafjord when his banishment was over, and he called the land he had found Greenland and gave it an attractive name to attract settlers. So even though it was really a chunk of ice, I mean, most of it is a glacier, but he called it Greenland for propaganda purposes. 10 years earlier, before he had gone to Greenland, Iceland had suffered a very bad famine, and in any case, all the land in Iceland had already been taken, and so rich and poor men alike faced a worsening prospect there. And as the population increased and there was no more land to go around, the younger sons were looking for a new place, and so they set out for Greenland. In 986, Leif sailed again for Greenland with 25 ships, 14 of which arrived safely. Okay, now that's kind of unusual. I wonder how he lost 10 ships. He must have gone through a storm in that area that must have hit a really bad storm in order to lose 10 of his ships. Well, 11 of his ships. No, wait a minute. Yeah, am I counting wrong? 11 of his ships he lost. In the first settlement area, the eastern settlement, Julianahab is the modern center. Eventually, the settlement numbered 190 farms and 12 parish churches. There was a cathedral at Gardar, the modern name of which is Igalico, and a monastery and a nunnery. 10 years later, men had pushed north as far as modern Godthab. And by the 14th century, the western settlement had 90 farms and 4 churches. Meanwhile, 400 Norse ruins have been discovered in Greenland. 300 of these are farms of varying size. Just north of the eastern settlement, there is a cluster of 20 farms, modern Iviktut. So the colonization of Greenland began with about 450 people, all Icelanders. And let me just make that capital there. And here is another map of Greenland where we might be able to see it a little bit better. We can see the whole thing. Here is where the crossing was made, and maybe I'll just draw a line there. Here is Breiðafjord, and they go across, right across here. and then down the coast here and around to the eastern settlement. Why do you think they settled only on the west coast of of Greenland? Anybody have any ideas why they only settled on the west coast?
Was it warmer?
It was warmer there. Why do you think the west coast was warmer?
Gulf Stream?
Gulf Stream, right, exactly. The Gulf Stream goes by there, so that it makes it warmer, and the main settlements are on the west coast. Again, the Gulf Stream is extremely important to all the northern lands here because it warms them up. And so the eastern settlement really becomes the first place, and then later the middle settlement, and then here this green is the western settlement, and a little bit north of that there is some more. But look at how huge Greenland is. I mean, it really is enormous, and I've taken this from a polar projection map, so it really is showing Greenland pretty much a true size. If you can see the pole here, this is the center of this map I was using to take it, so you can see all of this. And if you look at the dates up here where this part was explored, of course the Vikings got there first, but explorers didn't get there until the 19th century to find the ruins that the Vikings had left in this area. And the Vikings went all the way up in here to Canada. They found ruins all in there. So we'll see that in a minute, but here are the modern Viking settlements. The population would grow eventually to 3,000, and the Greenlanders quickly imposed a constitution on the Icelandic model, and so they brought the Icelandic model of the Althing, and they created a national assembly. They instituted a code of law on the pattern, on the model of Iceland, and they explored and hunted and traded and prospered. So at first they were they settled in Greenland and everything went fine. For export they had furs and hides and ropes, cables, oil, woolens, and sea ivory. White bears and falcons were very important. Why do you think they were so important in the trade of Greenland?
Is it the fur?
No. Actually, the white bears and falcons, they captured alive. And they took polar bears all over Europe to all the Scandinavian countries, and they were a wonderful commodity. They were a zoo animal. I mean, people started keeping zoos of all the strange animals that were around, and polar bears were one of the most prized things. And the bears weren't afraid of people, so they could train them very quickly and bring the polar bears. And so some of the sagas tell of the Icelanders and the Greenlanders bringing polar bears to the courts of the kings. And of course, they're very popular, and the kings are willing to pay huge sums of money for these wonderful bears. The falcons are used for hunting, and so later on in the Middle Ages, falconry became very important, and so falcons are a commodity to use for hunting. They train them, and they would track down small game. And they also use them for sport. But they had to import wheat and iron, including wrought weapons, and timber and clothing and luxuries of all kinds they had to import. So they really lived on the edge of civilization. I mean, they really didn't produce everything they needed in order to live. They needed trade goods, and most of what they needed, what they imported, came primarily from Norway, because remember, Iceland wasn't producing things that they could use for trade. So they had to go all the way, the Greenlanders had to go all the way to Norway, because Iceland didn't manufacture the things that they needed. By 1000, they were looking for more land to settle, and so they climbed mountains and looked north. Of course, the farther north they went, the icier it became, and so that was very inhospitable land. Nevertheless, this area here is the hunting grounds. This is where they would hunt all of their animals, seals, and fish and bears of all kinds. They would hunt them along here, and they went north along this western coast, exploring and hunting and putting little sites here. And in a later map I'll show you all the places where remains have been found of the Vikings being there. So they worked their way up this coast. They didn't really explore this coast very much. But they found nothing free from ice as they moved north except a little strip along the water's edge. So the glacier almost went to the edge of the island. So they looked for better hunting and fishing grounds. From Holsteinborg to the Nugsok Peninsula, the Nordsetter, the northern encampments or hunting grounds, men took narwhal and walrus, ptarmigan, reindeer, deer, and polar bears. Still farther north on the island of Kingig-Torsvåg near Uppernavik, just short of latitude 73, there is evidence of a 1267 expedition from the eastern settlement that reached Melville Bay at 76 degrees, and there they observed the tracks of the Skraelings in Kroksfjordar Heidi, or Disco Bay. And so we can find Disco Bay, which is, this is Disco Island, and this is Disco Bay. Okay, so around 1200 there are Eskimo remains here. They see tracks of Eskimos, because remember that when they came to Greenland, the island was empty. And now here are the hunting grounds along here. Meanwhile, the Eskimos were coming in this way, and the Eskimos here are called the Thule Eskimos, and this culture came from Canada and settled up here in Thule around 1100 to 1150, and the Eskimos were moving south down this coast while the Vikings were moving north up this coast. And so eventually the Eskimos overwhelmed the Viking cultures, because you can see the dates. The Eskimos are up here 1100 to 1150, and they're down and the Vikings are down in the eastern settlement in 1000 in the 900s. And so they move up here, and the Eskimos are down here by 1200. They have taken over this area by 1330. Meanwhile, there is a Viking site here in 1267, and the Vikings are also going in this direction. So they're crossing paths, and there's some interesting speculation about whether they intermarried and actually created a whole new kind of people that is a blend of Eskimo and Viking culture. And there's been some speculation about that as they mixed up here in that area, if they mixed. I mean, but it's so hard to tell. A lot of it is probability and guesswork about whether that happened. Then the Vikings got safely back home. 2 cairns were discovered in Jones Sound and 2 on Washington Irving Island in the Canadian Arctic at 76 degrees and 79 degrees. And in 1824, a runestone was found that stated that in 1333, 3 Norse Greenlanders camped and wintered there. And actually, there's a saga about that. There's one of the sagas tells about a camp far to the north of Greenland where somebody was trapped, and they actually reverted to cannibalism in that area. It was a very harsh country. But the most important areas remained Eriksfjord to Vatnaverfi, and here there were the best farms. Eriksfjord is at the very southern tip of Greenland, so it's that southern tip where the best farms are, and the best grazing is there. And Eric the Red and his son Leif Erikson and Leif's son Thorkel lived there in Eriksfjord. The leaders of the Greenland community also lived here at Brattahlid in the south of Greenland. And so here is Eriksfjord right down here. And so this is where everybody lived, the farthest place to the south. This is Jones Sound up here, and I couldn't find Washington Irving Island. I looked at about 6 maps and I couldn't find it, but I kind of suspect it's over in here someplace because they're heading in this direction to northern Canada. So that's the state of the art in Greenland. This, interestingly, everybody knew that Greenland was there, and even though Greenland was very isolated from the rest of Europe, people in all over Northern Europe knew that it was here. Here is a document. It's part of a letter of Pope Innocent III, and it mentions Greenland in the letter, and here it is. You can see it underlined. It's right there. It says Greenland, and so he mentions it. So as that's the 12th century. People in Europe knew that Greenland was there, and the Pope knew that Greenland was there. So it wasn't that the Vikings were going off, in a very isolated way all by themselves, but everybody in Northern Europe knew they were there. Adam of Bremen, of course, tells lots of stories about them, and he knew they were there. So everyone knew about Greenland. Here on the very tip of Brattahlid, of the tip of Greenland, Eric the Red's wife, Thjotildr, built the first Christian church, and Greenland's one cathedral at Gardar was a short walk away. But eventually, the Greenlanders surrendered their independence to Norway in 1261, a year before Iceland did. And so at that time in the 13th century, they no longer could maintain their independence, and Norway took over. But Norway, even so, they eventually faded away. From Eriksfjord would be mounted all the planned voyages of discovery and settlement to Baffin Island, Labrador, northern Newfoundland, and the first voyages to Vinland. Those first voyages to Vinland were not planned. Actually, again, Bjarni Herjolfsson was storm-driven to lands unsought, but not unsuspected. In fact, if you climbed a mountain in Greenland, you could see the coast of North America. You could see Canada there. And so they knew land was there. Nevertheless, they didn't try to go there until Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course, and he was blown to a land that he never suspected was there. Okay, and here I've switched to a different map, and this particular map is a map that dates from 1500 or later than 1500, where we have all the voyages of discovery of Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and all the other explorers who went to the New World, and just an explosion of explorers. But I picked it because it has a really good map of the east coast of the Americas here, so we can see where the Vikings went. And here we can see the Vikings as the first ones to go here. They also went from here up to Baffin Island to the north, and probably across here to Labrador. And we'll look at some of those places in a moment. Bjarni Herjolfsson had spent the winter of 985-6 in Norway, and in 987 he sailed to Iceland, intending to spend the winter with his father. When he arrived, he found that his father, Herjolf, had sold his estates and left for Greenland on Eric the Red's colonizing expedition. So with the consent of his crew, Bjarni set off to follow his father, and it was a risky journey, pilotless, chartless, and compassless. He just knew he had to sail west, and so even though it was a short distance, he did sail west, but there were lots of storms in that area, and 3 days out, Iceland couldn't be seen. The north winds and the fog enveloped them, and they had no notion of which way to go. When the sun broke through, they took fresh bearings, and then they sailed a whole day westward, and then they sighted a land that was not mountainous like Greenland, but rather it was well forested. There were low hills, and Bjarni knew it was not Greenland. But Bjarni was too single-minded and prudent to go ashore, and so he sailed along the coast for 2 days. He saw that the land here was well forested but flat, and again he refused to land. Then he sailed southwest for 3 more days and came to a land that was high and mountainous and glaciered. Now he turned his prow from the land, and after 4 days sailing before a strong wind, he reached Herjolfsnes in Greenland. And the Greenlander Saga has preserved his logbook in essence. What it is a description of his journeys, what he saw, and then exactly the directions of how to return to Greenland from the New World. And so because Bjarni didn't set foot on the New World, Leif Erikson, who knew all about the journey and heard about it, and was able to retrace his steps and then claim in his saga that he discovered the New World, that he discovered Vinland, because he just wrote Bjarni out of the story. So that's what happened to Bjarni. So here we can see him going storm-tossed, and this is such a short distance, but the wind blew him this way, and probably he landed somewhere here, sailed north, and then sailed south, and then was able to go back to Greenland, to Herjolfsnes, which is also at the tip of Greenland. Eric the Red Saga does not mention Bjarni. In fact, it ascribes the discovery to Leif Erikson. Certainly, Leif was the first to actually land there. For 15 years, in fact, the Greenlanders did not follow up Bjarni's voyage. They probably believed him because, as we said, Vinland could be seen from Greenland's high mountains. Leif Erikson then sailed south from Brattahlid to meet Bjarni at Herjolfsnes. In fact, Leif Erikson bought Bjarni's ship and enlisted some of his crew. So he actually had people there who had been there before. He then set out on a voyage of discovery, and he took Bjarni's logbook, the account in the Greenlander Saga of Bjarni sailing there, and he retraced his steps. He sailed it backwards. And he put ashore on 3 identifiable areas and bestowed names on them. Okay, the names he named were Helluland, which means flat stone land, and he described it as mountainous and grassless, barren with a lot of glaciers. So it was a very icy, mountainous, and barren land. Could it be the southern portion of Baffin Island? That's mostly what people think it is, the southern portion of Baffin Island. Another land that he saw and identified, he called Markland, which means woodland, and it was flat and forested with white sandy beaches. Possibly this was Labrador, south of the medieval tree line, which would be south of Nain. And so we're kind of, we think there's a good probability that we can identify those 2 lands. However, the third land, Vinland, we're not sure that we can identify. Vinland means wineland, and it's an island north of a mainland with a cape projecting northwards from it. Leif then wintered here in Vinland at Leifsbudur, which means Leif's Booths, and what he did was build some houses there called booths, and those were his houses. He then described the land. The chronicles describe, or the sagas describe, what the land was like that he saw. The day and night were of a more even length than in Iceland or Greenland. Now, what would that tell you? What would that tell you about the location of Vinland if the day and night are of a more even length than they are in Iceland or Greenland? They're farther south. They have to be farther to the south. So it has to be somewhere in a more southern latitude than Iceland or Greenland. Okay, let's look at some more of these clues. And so here we have Iceland and, oh, I've got it upside down. All right, let me fix that. Okay. We'll just put it in this. Okay. Here we are. It's got to be farther south than Iceland or Greenland, and that would be probably right about here southward. Anywhere to the south could be the land that they're talking about here, because this would be anywhere south of Iceland or Greenland. On the shortest day of winter, the sun was visible above the horizon at about 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So we've got the sun rising at 9 a.m. and setting at 3 p.m. All right, has anybody been in any place in the northern hemisphere where it had noted the time on the winter solstice of when the sun rose and set? Anybody looked at that or thought about it when you've been in Europe at all? Well, by the strangest coincidence, I have. When I lived in London, I was Christmas shopping on December 21st, which was the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And I had taken my son to school that day and noticed that the sun came up at 9 a.m. because he had to walk to school in the dark, and I had to get him there by 9, and so the sun came up at 9 a.m. And then I went Christmas shopping. I went on the bus to one of the shopping centers in London, and I finished my shopping and went to the bus stop and was standing there at the bus stop at 3 o'clock and was astonished to see that the sun was setting. And this was in London, okay? It was just the strangest coincidence that I noticed that day when the sun came up and when the sun set. So, if that's true, then if we look at our map, then we can say that at least he might have landed and described a place that might be on the same latitude as London, which would be right about here on this. This was, let's see, I think this is 50 degrees north latitude. So it might be right about here, Newfoundland. And strangely enough, remember I was reading you the news story about Lansau Meadows? That's exactly where Lansau Meadows is, right exactly there in that spot. And that would be on the right latitude to make it the same as London for the day and the night. Well, let's put this map aside and look at some other of these clues. A frostless winter. Well, the Vikings, of course, would notice that there was a frostless winter. That's a little harder to figure out where there was a frostless winter. They reported grass growing and grapes. They reported grass, self-sown wheat that would, it was wild wheat that would sow itself, and they recognized it as wheat, and they saw that there were grapes. They described timber, so it's forested, it's a land that is forested, and they also talked about the salmon running, and so they described salmon there. When Leif returned to Greenland, Eric was dead, so Leif had to take over his father's responsibilities and run the Greenland community in the Eastern Settlement, or in the Eastern Settlement, and so his sailing days were over. His brother Thorvald stepped forward with a scheme to explore the new lands. Thorvald sailed the known route to Leifsbadur in Vinland, and he knew exactly where Leif's houses were, and he was able to return to them. He sent his men on a probe down the west coast, and he himself headed north past a cape that he named Hjallarnes, or Keelness. So here he is, sailing down the west coast. He went across possibly to Leifsbadur here and started down the west coast, and then he sent his men south and he went north and described something called Keelness, and we have no idea where that is, no idea what it is. Further north he saw a big inlet leading west. Okay, what could that have been? Well, is it the St. Lawrence River here? If he went south, is it the St. Lawrence River? Is it up here, Hudson's Bay? Is it any rivers along this shore? Again, we have no idea what he saw there. Here he met the first natives, and Thorvald provoked hostilities, and he was killed by the natives. His crew then returned to Leifsbadur and wintered there and returned to Eriksfjord in Greenland. Now, yet another expedition set out for Vinland, and this was led by Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was an Icelander, and he had married Eric the Red's daughter-in-law, Gudrid. He had in mind an extended or even a permanent stay. A number of his men took their wives with them, and they also took all kinds of livestock. The Greenlander Saga and Eric's Saga each offer different accounts. One of them says that Karlsefni with 60 men followed Leif's routes and arrived at Leifswadur and stayed there, and that's the Greenlander Saga. And here are some Indians that they might have encountered. It's hard to tell which Indians. Here's a kind of picture of the Indians of North America that were encountered by Roger Williams in the first settlement of the English there. And so the Indians that the Vikings might have encountered might well have looked like these Indians. According to Eric's Saga, Karlsefni took 3 ships and 160 men from Brattahlid to somewhere north of the western settlement, and then crossed the Davis Strait with a north wind in 2 days to Baffin Island, named it Helluland, then went south to Labrador and named it Markland, also named Keelness, where he found a ship's keel, and also named Fufustrandir, or Marvel Strands, which were remarkably long beaches. And this version in Eric's Saga flatly contradicts the Greenlander Saga. According to, and I'm kind of looking at the Gwyn Jones in the North Atlantic Saga, Gwyn Jones thinks that Eric's Saga is probably wrong. Eric's Saga said Thorvald Eriksson was with this voyage, and Eric's Saga mentions 2 other places of settlement: Stromfjord or Streamford, which might be Newfoundland, and Hop, which was further south, a landlocked bay or estuary. And again, it describes wild grapes growing and self-sown wheat and tall timber. It describes a snowless winter at Hop, but a bitter one at Stromfjord. And again, it talks about natives and describes the Vikings as fighting them. Thorvald Eriksson was killed north of Stromfjord, and Karlsefni deals with the natives, or Skraelings, which means screechers or uglies, began with a sudden confrontation, and then they proceeded to trade by barter and ended in hostilities. And so I think I have that account here that I can read for you. Okay, the account of the Skraelings. All right, here we go. Skraelingar is a word of uncertain but uncomplimentary meaning, possibly screechers or uglies, and they began with a surprise confrontation. Of their trading, the Greenlander Lendinga Saga has this to say. After that first winter came summer. It was now they made acquaintance with the Skraelings, when a big body of men appeared out of the forest there. Their cattle were close by. The bull began to bellow and bawl loudly, which so frightened the Skraelings that they ran off with their packs, which were of grey furs and sables and skins of all kinds, and headed for Karlsefni's house, hoping to get inside there. But Karlsefni had the doors guarded. Why do you think the Indians were so afraid of the cattle and the bull bellowing? Why do you think they were so afraid? Anybody know? Why they would have been scared so much? Yes, is someone in...
Probably had never seen them before.
Why do you think they had never seen them before?
Well, weren't the cattle and everything brought from Greenland with them on the voyage?
Yes, they brought the cattle from Greenland with the voyage because cattle are not native to the New World. And the Indians would never have seen cattle before. And so a bull who would bellow would really scare them, and so they ran in panic, trying to run into Karlsefni's house to try to protect themselves, but Karlsefni had the doors guarded and wouldn't let them in. Okay, neither party could understand the other's language. They couldn't talk to each other, and so this was terrible. Then the Skraelings unslung their bales, untied them, and proffered their wares, and above all wanted weapons in exchange. Okay, so the Skraelings unpacked their furs, and they were offering, and they wanted weapons. Karlsefni, though, forbade them the sale of weapons, and now he hit on an idea. He told the women to carry out milk to them, and the moment they saw the milk, that was the one thing they wanted to buy, nothing else. So that was what came of the Skraelings trading. They carried away what they bought in their bellies, while Karlsefni and his comrades kept their bales and their furs, and with that they went away. Okay, now this would have terrible consequences, because the next day the Indians came and they attacked the Vikings. Why do you think they did that? Anybody have a clue as to why the Indians would now attack the very next day? Yeah.
They want the cows?
Because they what? They wanted the cows. Yeah, that they might have wanted the cows if the milk had agreed with them. The problem is that they had an intolerance for milk. They were allergic to the milk, and it made them sick. And so they thought the Vikings had tried to poison them, and so that's why they came and attacked the Vikings the next day. Okay, this is what Eric's saga said, describing the Vikings. The Skraelings. Then early one morning when they looked about them, they saw a great multitude of skin boats on board, which staves were being swung, which sounded just like flails flashing, and their motion was sunwise. "What can this mean?" asked Karlsefni. "Perhaps it is a token of peace," replied Snorri, "so let us take a white shield and hold it out towards them." They did so, and those others rowed towards them, showing their astonishment, then came ashore. They were small and dark, ill-favored men, and had ugly hair on their heads. They had big eyes and were broad in the cheeks. For a while they remained there, astonished, and afterwards rowed off south past the headland. Okay, this is the account in Eric's saga, which is a different account. Karlsefni and his men built themselves dwellings up above the lake. Some of their houses stood near the mainland and some near the lake. They now spent the winter there. No snow fell, and their entire stock found its food grazing in the open, their entire stock of cattle. But once spring came in, they chanced early one morning to see how a multitude of skin boats came rowing from the south round the headland, so many that the bay appeared sown with coals. And even so, staves were being swung on every boat. Karlsefni and his men raised their shields, and they began trading together. And this is a different story about what the Indians wanted. Above all, these people wanted to buy red cloth, in return for which they had furs to offer and gray pelts. They also wanted to buy swords and spears, but this Karlsefni and Snorri would not allow. They had dark, unblemished skins to exchange for the cloth, and were taking a span's length of cloth for a skin, and this they tied round their heads. So it continued for a while. Then when the cloth began to run short, they cut it up so that it was no broader than a finger breadth, but the Skraelings gave just as much for it or more. Okay, so one version says they traded for milk, and one version says they wanted red cloth. And they probably wanted red cloth because they were wearing skins or leather clothing at the time. They may not have ever seen red cloth before, which would have been interesting for them. Well, the outbreak of hostilities was decisive because the Norsemen had no superiority of weapons, and the lines of communication were thin and overlong, and there were just too many Indians for them, who eventually drove them out of there. There was an insufficient reservoir of manpower back in Greenland. They just couldn't send enough people in to overwhelm the Skraelings, because there were just so many of the Skraelings. And here are some Indians coming along in their skin boats, which is what the Vikings had described. After a far from happy stay lasting 3 winters, Karlsefni decided to leave. Jealousy and ill feeling in the camp over the women they had brought caused a lot of trouble. Karlsefni said there would always be fear and strife with the natives, so he went home. Nevertheless, the Greenlander saga mentions one more voyage to Leifsbadir, led by Freydis Eriksdottir, sister of Leif and Thorvald. It's a bloody and melodramatic affair, and let's see, which book is it in? It's in this one. Let me read you the account of Freydis Eriksdottir. Okay. Karlsefni had returned to Greenland and reached Eriksfjord safely with a ship, and it was there they spent the winter. Now there was fresh talk of a Vinland voyage, for this appeared an enterprise once profitable and honorable. The same summer that Karlsefni returned from Vinland, a ship arrived in Greenland from Norway, commanded by 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, who stayed there in Greenland over the winter. These brothers were Icelanders by descent and from the East Firths. The next thing to report is that Freydis Eriksdottir made a journey from her home at Gardar. She called to see the brothers Helgi and Finnbogi and invited them to take their vessel on an expedition to Greenland and have equal shares with her in all such profit as they might obtain there. They said they would, so from them she went on to see her brother Leif and asked him to give her the houses he had built in Vinland. He made his usual answer. He would lend the houses, he said, but not give them. The arrangement between Freydis and the brothers was this, that they should each take 30 able-bodied men on their ship, in addition to any womenfolk. But Freydis immediately showed her disregard for this, taking an extra 5 men and so concealing them that the brothers had no suspicion of it until they reached Vinland. Now they put to sea, having arranged beforehand that so far as possible they would sail in company. There was indeed little between them, but even so the brothers arrived a shade ahead and carried their gear up to Leif's houses. But once Freydis arrived, they too unloaded ship and carried their gear up to the houses. "Why have you carried your stuff in here?" Freydis demanded. "Because we assumed," they said, "the whole arrangement between us would be kept." "Leif left the houses to me," she retorted, "not to you." "We are no match for you in wickedness, we brothers," said Helgi. They moved their gear out and built their own hall, siting it further away from the sea by the lakeside and making the necessary preparations, while Freydis had timber felled for her ship. Now winter set in, and the brothers suggested starting games and holding entertainments to pass the time. That was the way of it for a while, till there was a turn for the worse between them, and deep division made, and the games ended, and no coming and going between the houses. This went on for much of the winter. Then early one morning Freydis got out of bed and put on her clothes, but not her shoes and stockings, and such was the weather that a heavy dew had fallen. She took her husband's cloak, wrapped it about her, and then walked over to the brothers' house to the door. A man had gone outside a little earlier and left the door ajar. She pushed it open and stood in the entrance a while without saying a word. Finnbogi was lying at the innermost end of the hall. He was awake. "What do you want, Freydis?" "For you to get up and come outside with me. I want to talk to you." So that is what he did. They walked to a tree trunk which lay under the wall of the house and sat down on it. "How are you liking things?" she asked him. "I think the country a good and fruitful one," he replied, "but this cold wind blowing between us, I think that bad, for I swear there is no reason for it." "As you say," said she, "I think the same, but my business in coming to see you is that I should like to trade ships with you brothers, for you have a bigger one than mine, and I want to get away from here." "I can meet you on that," he said, "if it will please you." With that they parted. She went home and Finnbogi back to bed. She climbed into bed with her cold feet, and at this Thorvard awoke and asked why she was so cold and wet. She answered in a passion, "I have been to those brothers," she said, "asking to buy their ship. I wanted to buy a bigger one, but they took it so badly that they beat me up, maltreated me, and you, wretch that you are, will avenge neither my shame nor your own. I can see now that I am not back home in Greenland, but I shall separate from you unless you take vengeance for this." Her husband could not endure this baiting of hers. He ordered his men to turn out immediately and take their weapons, which they did, and crossed straightway to the brothers' house and marched in on the sleeping men, seizing them and bound them, then led them outside, each man as he was bound. And Freydis had each man killed as he came out. Now all the men were killed, but the women were left, and no one would kill them. "Hand me an axe," said Freydis, which was done, and she turned upon the 5 women they had there and left them dead. Okay, now with this wicked deed, they return to their own quarters. They end up, and there's more to the story. Freydis does some other really savage and heroic kinds of things, but eventually they end up fighting the Skraelings again, and she fights the Skraelings, and they end up going home because the Skraelings were just too much for them. Well, these voyages were over and done with by 1020 at the latest. So these only for about 20 years did they spend any time in the New World. There are important and trustworthy references to Vinland in Adam of Bremen around 1075, in the Icelandic Annals for 1121 and 1347, and in Ares Icelandingabok around 1125. There are a number of casual references to Vinland in Icelandic histories and a saga of the 13th century, and also in 14th century Icelandic geographical treatises. And here we are, getting to the point where we're almost to the time of Christopher Columbus, when everybody already knew that Vinland was out there. Adam of Bremen's report was reliable, and here is his report. Okay. See. Adam of Bremen derived his information about Vinland from Svein Estridsson, king of the Danes, who died in 1076. Quote, "He told me, too, of yet another island discovered by many in that ocean which is called Wineland, from the circumstance that vines grow there of their own accord and produce the most excellent wine. While that there is an abundance of unsown grain there, we have learned not from fabulous conjecture, but from the trustworthy report of the Danes. There is also a less reputable but all too well-known body of evidence on offer for a Norse presence in North America." Okay, there are a lot of legendary hoaxes in around the Minnesota area where the Scandinavians settled later on. But this is the account of Adam of Bremen. The only archaeological find, as we mentioned before, is the one found by Helga and Ann Stein Ingstad at Lansall Meadows in northern Newfoundland. It includes a smithy, a soapstone spinning whorl, probably from Greenland, and dating to 1000, the year 1000. And so here is the spot where Lansall Meadows is, right there on Newfoundland, right on that northern peninsula. And so that's clear and positive evidence that the Vikings were there. There's also an Indian arrowhead of quartzite identical to the quartzite of Labrador that was found in 1930 in the northwest corner of the churchyard at Sandnest in the western settlement in Greenland. So an Indian arrowhead of quartzite that had to have come from North America because the Eskimos did not use the bow and arrow, so it had to have been a Skraeling arrow because the quartzite was Labrador quartzite. There was an identical arrowhead found in an Indian settlement by the Northwest River in Lake Melville in 1956, where Thorvald may have been killed. And chests of a wood called larch were found, that should be found, by Danish archaeologists at Herjolfsnes in Greenland, and the larch had to come from Newfoundland or Labrador. So there's a lot of evidence that the Vikings really did land there. Everyone agrees that Helluland is southern Baffin Islands and Markland is Labrador south of Nain. But where was Vinland? Okay, we have a few minutes left over. Let's remember the clues. It is far enough south to have a snowless winter. Okay, has anybody lived on the East Coast? How far south do you have to go to have a snowless winter? Anybody have a clue? Okay, probably not Massachusetts or Boston. Anybody ever lived in Washington, D.C., maybe? Yeah, did they ever have snowless winters?
No, we had like 12 feet of snow.
12 feet of snow, okay. So Washington, D.C., it has to be south of Washington, D.C. to have a snowless winter. How far south do you have to go to have a snowless winter? Virginia?
Into the lower Carolinas.
You think the lower Carolinas might be where you have to go? Yeah, that's kind of my guess too. Maybe North or South Carolina in that area. Where would that be on that map? That would be maybe about here. Am I in the right place? Is that about the right place?
Go up slightly.
Up slightly. There. Okay, about there.
Somewhere right about in there.
Yeah, okay, so maybe they got as far south as that. Although people have suspected they got as far south as Florida. Okay, but a snowless winter, maybe our southern boundary can be right about there in North Carolina. Okay, the next clue is they were far enough north for the salmon to run. Okay, anybody familiar with Canadian history up in the north? How far north do the salmon run? We can also think about Washington and Oregon as being places where the salmon might run. Where do the salmon run? Has anybody lived in that area of the country?
Well, when I worked radio up in the Northeast, I know that I used to be able to catch salmon over off of Lake Ontario and some of the tributaries through there, and heading on up into the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Okay.
You get salmon up through there.
Okay, there would be salmon here, and let's get our map. Maybe Lake Ontario and going up the St. Lawrence River. So this would be a likely place where there would be salmon running. Okay, good. So that might be that would be a good place where we can expect they might have been. So in maybe this area, or if the salmon are running here, they would run down here too, don't you think? Was that logical?
Very possibly.
Yeah, I would think so. Okay, let's look. Okay, a bay or estuary with a promontory on the south. What possibilities would there be? A bay or estuary with a promontory on the south. What do you think there? Here's one right here. We're getting into the Massachusetts area, I think, there. No, is that Maine? Would that be more like Maine? Chesapeake Bay would be Maryland. Could be anywhere. Could be anywhere. The coastline is filled with bays with promontories, so it could be anywhere along that east coast. Okay, so that doesn't help us very much. The winter solstice, the sun rises at 9 a.m. and sets at 3 p.m. Okay, we already identified that that would be about the same latitude as London, so that might be up here. So we know they got as far north as that. Probably they were in Labrador. Probably they were up here as well. All right, wild grapes and self-sown wheat. Where do grapes grow and wheat grow in that area? Anybody familiar? Who are you from Ontario? Lake Ontario. Do grapes grow up there?
Well, I've seen some grapes grow. Like I said, I worked in radio, so I'm not that familiar with the agricultural area, but I do remember when I traveled across the Mackinac on into Canada that there was some wheat that grew up in that area.
So you can grow.
As for grapes, I'm not sure.
You can grow wheat in that
You can
area.
grow some wheat. You can grow wheat and some grains, but I'm not sure about grapes.
Okay. Now, Lake Ontario is here, and the St. Lawrence Seaway goes here. I happen to have lived in that area as well. That is upstate New York, and believe it or not, there are wineries up there, and they grow and they make wine in that area. They actually grow grapes up there. Also in Michigan, around the Detroit area, they grow wine there. The grapes there for wine. There are wineries there. But there are New York wineries in upstate New York, so it's amazing how far north the grapes actually will grow. So that they could grow grapes in that area. Okay. So, and wheat grows in that area around Lake Ontario. Now let's see what other clues we have. A river with a ford. Okay. Which rivers do you think might have a ford along here? Our map isn't quite small enough for us. I mean, big enough. The land isn't big enough to see. Well, I kind of doubt it's the St. Lawrence Seaway. That would not be a river with a ford, would it? Because it's really wide. It's really wide up there. Okay, it probably is one of these. It could be any of these little rivers all down the coast. There are so many rivers along there. But this Chesapeake Bay might not be a likely one because you have to go in so far. But any of these could be a river. Okay, it's rich in forests and timber. Where do you think that would be along the East Coast? Where would that be? Anywhere. Okay, it might be anywhere along there.
Vermont, New Hampshire, yeah.
Yeah, Vermont, New Hampshire would be filled with forest. Yeah, that would be ideal for that land. And how about Indian settlements? Where do you think it would be possible? Those of you who study American history, where would Indian settlements have been in that area? Anywhere, anywhere. The Indian settlements would have been thick along here and up into Canada. So everything matches. I mean, everything matches for being on that coast, and they could, if for the snowless winter, they could have been as far south as North Carolina, unless the weather was really unusual for a few years there. But a snowless winter, that is really... so where do you think is the likeliest place to find Vinland? Any guesses what would be the likeliest place? Is there any place here that matches almost all of these categories? Actually, no. No single place matches everything. Although the farther south you get, the more you would have wheat and grain. But then to have the salmon run around Lake Ontario is a good place. That area, this area right in here, looks like the most likely. Well, let me show you what somebody's guess has been. Here's another Indian. This is an Osceola Indian. I believe they're in Florida, so there's been a guess there as far south as Florida. Here is Lake Halifax, or here is Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia, and it has a lot of the qualities that the Vikings would love, all these little islands and fjords and bays going in here, but virtually any place along the coast would be like that. Here are some guesses where it could be. Was Vinland right along here? Did they go down here? This is a little bit blown up. Here is Lansau Meadows right on the tip here. This is probably Markland. This is probably Helluland. But here is a guess in a 19th century book that I was using to get maps from, And this is actually Massachusetts Bay, and the author thinks Massachusetts Bay is the ideal place for the Vikings to have been. And again, just like Halifax, you can see the Vikings would have loved this. It would have been just like home, wouldn't it? So this might have been a very likely place. Well, wherever the Vikings went, and we're not sure, I mean, we know they went to Vinland, we know they went to North America for absolute sure. We still haven't found exactly where Vinland is, but it's surely along that coast somewhere, and this is a very good, likely place for it to be. What happened to the Greenland settlement? Well, somewhere around 1350, it just kind of disappeared. And interestingly, there's all kinds of conjecture about what happened to it. There's, let's see if I can find this little conjecture here about it. They see, there are experts who look at the Norsemen and they see 3 Norse or part Norse entries into Arctic Canada. The first was by way of Norse voyages of exploration and exploitation. The second was by way of a racial blending of Norse and Viking hunters and trappers with the Dorset Eskimos, which produced the Thule people. So there's some speculation that some of the Greenland natives were Eskimos intermarried with the Vikings and produced a new group of people. And then the Thule Eskimos, who were a blend of Vikings and Eskimos, then departed across the Davis Strait into Baffin Island and became a fast diminishing part of the bloodstream of the inhabitants there before the next wave of European voyages and acquisition. So there's a lot of speculation that probably the Vikings in the Greenland colony eventually intermarried and were absorbed by the Eskimos. And as we looked at the Eskimos moving south, as the Vikings were moving north, this is a reasonable conjecture. Finally, a number of Thule Eskimo folk tales contain references to a mysterious people called the Tunit or Tornit, and at least some experts think these Eskimo folk tales refer to the Vikings. So it's a mystery what happened to them, but whatever happened, they disappeared and they're now gone. Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll turn eastward and look at Russia.